Hey people, it's Niya's talking. Now this is a story of I can't remember where I heard it, but it was a YouTube video. So this is from Indian Express. Malik Ambar, the African slave who built Aurangabad and ruined the game for Mughals in the Deccan. The story of Malik Ambar, an African slave turned warrior, is an unusual one. Sold abroad several times by slave dealers during his youth, fate brought him miles away from his home in Ethiopia to India. Among several allegorical paintings created by Abul Hassan, chief painter at Emperor Jahangir's court, is one depicting the Mughal sovereign shooting arrows at the severed head of an Abyssinian slave. Created somewhere in 1620, the painting is a perfect depiction of Jahangir's fury towards a man considered his arch nemesis, the one he lambasts as the ill-starred and the black-fated, and who throughout his life remained a thorn in the flesh for the empire in the Deccan. The story of Malik Ambar, an African slave turned warrior, is an unusual one. Sold or bought several times by slave dealers during his youth, fate brought him miles away from his home in Ethiopia to India. In India, not only did Ambar get his freedom back, but he also rose up the social ladder, got an army, vast estates, and founded a city that today goes by the name Aurangabad. Born in 1548 in southern Ethiopia's Kambata kingdom, Ambar is believed to have been associated with the Oromo tribe, an ethnic group that now represents over 35% of the country's population. He was known by the name of Chapu until he fell into the hands of slave dealers. Historians believe he was either captured during a war or was sold into the trade by his poor parents due to poverty. Soon the young Abyssinian was paraded with other slaves in markets across the Middle East, where he was bought by an Arab. Thereafter he was bought and resold on several occasions. Citing a contemporary European source and Persian chronicles, historian Richard M. Eaton, in his book A Social History of the Deccan, 1300 to 1761, 8 Indian Lives, writes that Chapu was sold in the Red Sea port of Mocha in Yemen for the sum of 80 Dutch guilders. From there he was taken to Baghdad and sold to a prominent merchant, who, recognizing Chapu's superior intellectual qualities, raised and educated the youth, converted him to Islam, and gave him the name Ambar. In the early 1570s, Ambar was taken to the Deccan, as southern India was then called. Here he was purchased by a certain Chengiz Khan. Khan himself was a former slave who had risen to hold the office of Peshwa, or chief minister of the Nizam Shahi Sultanate or Ahmadnagar in India. The rise of the African slave. Ambar was amongst one of 1,000 other Habshi, a term used to refer to members of other various ethnic communities from the Abyssinian highlands purchased by Khan when freight brought him to the Deccan. Eaton notes that the Deccan sultanates were simultaneously recruiting the Habshis as slaves in the 16th centuries. They are highly valued for their physical strength and loyalty and were frequently put to military service. The 14th century medieval Moroccan scholar and traveler Ibn Battuta in his writings mentions the Habshis were guarantors of safety for ships traveling in the Indian Ocean. He notes that slaves had such a reputation that even if one was on board, their ship would be avoided by pirates. However, in Deccan society, slaves did not have a permanent status. Upon the death of their masters, they were usually set free and served as per their free will in service of powerful commanders in the empire. Some even reached such heights that they were seen as political game changers, as happened in the case of Ambar. 5 years after taking him on, Ambar's master and patron Chengiz Khan died, and Ambar was set free. For the next 20 years, he served as mercenary for the Sultan of neighboring Bijapur. It is here he was given charge of a small troop and bestowed with the title Malik. Ambar's land. In 1595, Malik Ambar returned to the Ahmadnagar Sultanate and served another Habshi lord. This was the time when the Mughal Emperor Akbar laid eyes on the Deccan and began a significant military expedition towards Ahmednagar. This was also Akbar's last expedition before he passed away. It was really during the Mughal invasion of Ahmednagar in the late 1590s that Malik Ambar truly came into his own. Historian Manu S. Pillai writes in his book Rebel Sultans, the Deccan from Khilji to Shivaji. At the time of the first siege, he had less than 150 cavalrymen in his command, and he joined himself to a more established Habshi lord. But as war shred to pieces the nobility and challenged the loyalties of large numbers of men, within a year, Ambar held in his control 3,000 warriors. By 1600, this number rose to almost 7,000, now including Marathas and other Daknis, a multiracial, multi-ethnic force that broadly shared a regional identity distinct from the northern Mughals, writes Pillai. In the coming years, Ambar married one of his daughters to a 20-year-old scion of Ahmadnagar's royal family in neighboring Bijapur, protecting him as a future ruler of the Nizam Shahi state against the Mughals. Cleverly using muscle when it was needed and trickery when that suited his ends, Ambar emerged as the principal force in what used to be the Ahmednagar state. At the height of his power, it was said that Nizam Shahi of the western Deccan was simply referred to as Ambar's land, Pillai writes. Along with the Marathas, Ambar's feud with the Mughals, now led by Emperor Jahangir, lasted for decades. He was widely known for unleashing guerrilla warfare on the Mughals' army. Eden's book mentions that general after general were dispatched from Delhi towards the south to beat the Ethiopian, but failed. The more times he defeated superior Mughal armies, the more men rallied to his side. In 1610, he even managed to expel the Mughals from Ahmednagar fort, Eden notes. Apart from being an able fighter, Ambar was also a fine administrator. In 1610, after briefly expelling the Mughals from Ahmednagar, Ambar established a new city, a capital named Kirki, present-day Aurangabad in Maharashtra, for the Sultanate. The city eventually became home to over 2 million people, including the Marathas. I'm not sure if I'm reading right. Let's see, I think there's 20,000 people. It's just been written wrong, including the Marathas, after whom several suburbs such as Malpura, Kelpura, Paraspura, and Vifapura came to be named. It was around 1610-11 that Ambar made Kirki his base, and it slowly emerged as a major urban center, where, like Ambar, much of his Maratha nobility and military leadership also built houses and developed localities. Pillai says in an email interview with IndianExpress.com, waterworks and an underground canal were among the early developments he brought about, which is how a lot of cities in the dry Deccan area were able to expand. We see it with Bijapur as well, decades before, and this required considerable expertise in engineering and planning. In the coming wars, the city, along with the Ahmednagar Sultanate, fell to the Mughals. It was under the reign of the 17th century Mughal monarch Aurangzeb that the city came to be named as Aurangabad. They too added to the city's infrastructure and allowed the city to grow. This included improving and expanding the waterworks, but in the middle, there were also one or two devastating attacks on the city that ruined much of its beauty, even though it managed to recover and rebuild itself with time, says Pillai. Pillai says Ambar, in building a new city in the first place, seemed to mark his legacy. This was, after all, the time of great builders, and you would not be surprised that the Habshi warlord also wished to follow in that tradition. He is supposed to have built both the Jama Masjid and Kali Masjid in Aurangabad, as the city was later named by the Mughals. The Abyssinian is also credited with a more efficient land revenue model of the time, which was used by the Marathas and the Shivaji, whose grandfather Molaji was a close aide of Ambar. In years to come, Shivaji, in his grand epic poem Siva Bharata, also mentioned Ambar, referring him brave as the sun. Ambar died in 1626 and was laid to rest in a mausoleum designed by him in Kuldabad. Surprisingly, upon his death, Emperor Jahangir's surrogate diarist Motammed Khan made an entry. He had no equal in warfare, in command, in sound judgment, and in administration. History records no other incidents of an Abyssinian slave arriving at such eminence. Further reading A History of the Deccans in Sultans of Deccan India, Opulence and Fantasy, 1500 to 1700 by Richard M. Eaton, Rebel Sultans, the Deccan from Khilji to Shivaji by Manu S. Pillai, A Social History of the Deccans, 1300 to 1761, 8 Indian Lives by Richard M. Eaton. I hope you enjoyed this. Please comment, rate, share, and subscribe. I'm going to leave this article in the description. I'll leave some more if I can find them. If you'd like to support this channel, you might go find me in the description. If you'd like to follow me on Instagram, I'll leave that as well. And if you want to buy one of my t-shirts, I'll leave that there as well. Peace.